Born in Ghent in modern-day Belgium in 1340, John of Gaunt was the third-born son of King Edward III. John would become an increasingly wealthy and powerful man, which earned him a few enemies in the process. He and his son would be a target during the peasants' revolt of 1381, with John, fortunately for him, being in the north at the time and away from the worst of the troubles. Had John been in or around London, or at least somewhere in the south, his very life would have been in grave peril. As it was, his son, Henry Bolingbroke, seeking refuge at the Tower of London alongside King Richard II, just about escaped being brutally murdered. During the revolt, John's Savoy palace was destroyed. Such was his poor reputation at the time. However, after John's failed attempts to become King of Castile by right of his second marriage to Constance of Castile, he returned to England, where he made some sort of amends by trying to ease the escalating political tensions in Richard II's kingdom. At the time of John's birth, Edward III was attempting to establish his right to become King of France, and was waging war against the French King Philip VI. When John was only 3 months old, Edward III defeated a French fleet at the naval battle of Sluys, as the English king dominated the early stages of the conflict that would become known as the Hundred Years' War. Shortly before John's birth, Edward had sent his queen Philippa to Ghent, whilst he returned to England to raise money for his campaign. As mentioned, it was at Ghent that John would be born. As she did with all her many children, Queen Philippa, unusually for a medieval queen, breastfed John herself. Later in life, John, to his anger, heard rumours surrounding his parentage, with enemies claiming that he was, in fact, the son of a butcher. For a prince, John's childhood would have been normal enough, learning the practical skills that would be useful to him later in life. But his childhood became distinctly less normal in the late 1340s when the Black Death ripped through Europe and eventually reached England. As a royal child, John had a far better chance of survival than the children of working class or poor families. But John's family was nonetheless touched by the Black Death when John's sister Joan died of the plague whilst travelling to marry the Castilian prince Peter or Pedro, later known as the Cruel. Although life could be cut short in an instant even before the arrival of the Black Death, for young John the outbreak would have been a frightening experience. As he grew into a young man, John could have asked for no better role model to follow than his older brother Edward, known as the Black Prince. The Black Prince was a decade older than John, who would have heard all about Edward's exploits in battle, first at Crécy in 1346, where Edward was only 16 years old, and then at Poitiers a decade later. And it was at Poitiers that the Black Prince captured the French king, John II. Ever the chivalric knight, the Black Prince showed John II all due respect. Hearing stories such as those must have stirred John of Gaunt's soul somewhat, and perhaps roused some jealousy as well. As a young man, John would learn all about chivalry from not only his brother, but also his father, Edward III, who founded the Order of the Garter, and also was given an excellent example of chivalry by the French king, John II. After his capture at Poitiers, John II was held prisoner in England for a time before a ransom was agreed. He was then allowed to return to France to raise the money, but his son Louis was to be a hostage in the meantime. However, when Louis decided to flee, John II, ashamed that the terms of the agreement had been breached, returned voluntarily to England, despite pressure from his nobles not to go. Edward III welcomed John II warmly, and must have been hugely impressed by the French king's display of honesty. John II, in fact, would die in England in 1364. For John of Gaunt, this must have left quite the impression on him. John married Blanche of Lancaster in 1359 and was made Duke of Lancaster in 1362. With Blanche, John had three children, including Philippa, who became Queen of Portugal, and Henry, born in Bolingbroke, Lincolnshire, in 1367, who would one day become King Henry IV of England. Blanche died young, in her early to mid 20s, and it's speculated she died of the plague, although this isn't certain. In 1369, Edward III sent John, now a mature man of nearly 30, to France to again push the English king's claims. But the war was now of a different nature. Edward III was aging, and the English dominance of the early years of the war was becoming a distant memory, and the French king, Charles V, was a highly capable man who would reverse Edward's gains. Meanwhile, the Black Prince, accompanied by John, was laying siege to Limoges, ordering them to surrender. But no surrender was forthcoming, and eventually the Black Prince stormed the town, leading to an awful slaughter. Not long after, he returned to England, leaving John and his other brother, Edmund, to do what they could in managing the situation across Gascony. The truth is, they couldn't do much, at least for the time being. John would also return to England, accompanied by his new wife, Constance of Castile, daughter of Peter the Cruel. In 1373, John gathered a new army and launched another campaign in France, which accomplished next to nothing. It was said that John did little or no damage to the French, however, except for the payments he imposed on diverse places, nor did he do any harm to the enemy. His brother, the Black Prince, was in declining health, and Edward III, now an old man. For England, the war that had started so promisingly was now becoming little more than an expensive burden, with little left to show for the burdens of war that the country had carried for decades. For John of Gaunt, the war now looked increasingly unwinnable, and his nephew Richard II, who became king in 1377, seems to have been of a similar mindset. For the 10-year-old Richard, the situation he inherited was not a good one. The threat of a full-blown French invasion of England was gradually increasing, with raids taking place across the south coast. And in the north, the Scots, allies of the French, were causing trouble also. So it's hardly a surprise then that there was an atmosphere of extreme tension, and rumours circulated that John of Gaunt intended to usurp his nephew, claims that John strongly denied. However, John would earn widespread dislike for his role in the imposition of the poll tax of 1377, which would lead to a further two similar taxes in the following years. As Edward III lay on his deathbed, John, acting in his father's name, assembled Parliament. After such a prolonged period of war, the English crown was not in a good financial position, which John of Gaunt recognised, and with fears of a foreign invasion very real, money had to be raised to protect the kingdom. But hatred of these poll taxes was predictable and justified. The war in France, expensive as it was, had little to show for it now, and what didn't help John's cause in trying to secure the first poll tax was the fact that Edward III had in recent years squandered money on favourites like Alice Perez. Asking for a tax in this climate was not a good look. As indicated at the beginning of the video, it was fortunate for John that at the time of the granting of the third poll tax in 1380 he was away in the north, trying to protect the English borders from the Scots. Ironically enough, it would be the Scottish king, Robert II, who offered John protection when the peasants' revolt exploded into life in the summer of 1381. It was immediately obvious to John that he was potentially in the line of fire, and even though he appeared to be safely out of the way of the danger, which was largely confined to the southeast, John wasn't taking any chances, and he sought refuge with Robert. Indeed, it was the wise thing for John to do, as there were sporadic outbreaks of violence as far north as Yorkshire. When the revolt ended, John would have been extremely thankful that both he and his son Henry had, just about, kept their heads. Yes, the Savoy Palace may have gone, but that was replaceable for the wealthy Duke of Lancaster. In 1386, John decided to launch a bid for the crown of Castile. However, the campaign did not go according to plan, and it ran into difficulties, as the Castilian king, Juan I, was supported by the French. Having taken her with him, John did manage to marry his daughter Philippa to the King of Portugal in 1387. This was the main success of the expedition, and it soon became miserable as dysentery set in among John's ranks. Eventually, he had to call it quits. After leaving Iberia, John travelled to Gascony before returning to England, where he found the political situation dire. John's son, Henry Bolingbroke, had been a member of the Lords Appellant, a group of nobles that had removed unpopular members of Richard II's government. Both Richard and his cousin Henry were still young men, whilst John was, by now, a more worldly man, well travelled and experienced. Over the next decade, he acted virtually as a middleman, perhaps realizing that Richard, who could be a petty and vindictive man, could punish Henry heavily for his interference in how Richard wished to run his country. Using his political nous, John tried to ease Richard's ego, but in 1398 the king banished Henry from England. What would John have made of this? Perhaps a sense of relief. The year before, Richard had Thomas of Woodstock, his own uncle and John's brother, murdered. So exile was not the worst option for Henry. The year after, in 1399, John of Gaunt died, signalling the end for Richard II, as Henry stormed back into England to claim his Duchy of Lancaster and then the crown. John's influence lasted long after his death, and not just with Henry becoming king. John had 4 children with a mistress named Catherine Swynford, whom he eventually made his third wife. These 4 children, known as the Beauforts, would be a family that changed English history forever. John's great-granddaughter, Margaret Beaufort, gave birth in 1457 to a boy named Henry, who would become the first Tudor king as Henry VII, a dynasty that we all know well today. Hated by many, John of Gaunt, nevertheless, remains one of the most influential figures of the medieval era.